Thank you, Cynthia. I believe the Rotary Club is wise to be meeting virtually, though I wish we were in person because it would facilitate questions and answers and talking together. I always warn people when I've been asked to speak for 20 minutes or 25 minutes that I'm a college professor and used to speaking in 50-minute blocks. But in this case, I teach a whole course on Civil War memory. So you may prefer Zoom with a comfortable chair and the ability to mute me if I go on too long. Last May, George Floyd was killed by police in Minneapolis. That led to protests against police brutality there and throughout the nation. And within several weeks, protesters in Richmond covered the Lee Monument with graffiti. And the governor of Virginia called for that monument to come down. That's set off the latest skirmish in a continuing battle over Civil War memory, and may have something to do with the fact that I've been asked to talk today on why we are still fighting over Civil War memory. I want to start by talking about the way historians define memory, particularly public memory. The simplest way to explain that is to say that public memory is the way society tells its stories about the past. Memory is not history. History is what really happened. Memory is what we think about what happened. And often there is a tension between history and memory. Moreover, the public's memory of historical events is not always agreed upon. We frequently have competing memories of historical events. And often those competing memories rest as much in contemporary divisions and debates as they do in the history they purport to describe. I mention all three of those things because I think if you listen as time goes on in this talk, you'll see how all three of those shape our conceptions of the memory of the Civil War. So what I want to do first is talk a little bit about history very quickly. And then I'll give you a little bit of history about how the public memory of the Civil War has developed, looking at the immediate post-war period and the emergence of a 20th century compromise among white Americans about how to remember the Civil War. And then look at a division that emerges in the 1990s over Civil War memory before I return to our current division over Civil War memory. If you look at the history of the Civil War is about secession. And the 11 states that formed the Confederacy seceded from the Union because of the election of Abraham Lincoln. They believed that Lincoln and the Republican Party in power inevitably constituted a threat to slavery. And so they secede and form the Confederacy to create an independent slaveholding republic. They seceded to preserve slavery. They justified secession in various ways, as a reassertion of state sovereignty, as a response to the North's violation of the Constitutional Compact, or even, as Robert A. Lee did, as the right of revolution. The North denied the right of secession and believed that the Union was perpetual. They saw secession as rebellion, a term they would use for what the South did well into the 20th century. And they fought to preserve the Union. Lincoln also argued that they fought to preserve democracy. Lincoln believed that if a state could leave the Union because it disagreed with the outcome of an election, democracy could not be preserved. So the North marches off to fight the Civil War to preserve the Union, not to free the slaves. But as the war goes on, the war also becomes a war for emancipation. And when the North wins, you reestablished the nation and you freed the slaves. But the nation didn't immediately agree on what emancipation meant. From the very beginning, as soon as the war is over, you have the emergence of three very contrasting memories of the Civil War. And I want to try to describe that for you ever so briefly. You first have the African American memory of the Civil War. For African Americans, the Confederacy was an attempt to preserve slavery and white supremacy. And for them, emancipation is the central cause and the central result of the war. That, in fact, emancipation makes the preservation of the Union possible. Their memory of the war also celebrated the role of African American soldiers, who they, with good cause, claim played a central role in preserving the Union. And they believe that military service proved those soldiers' manhood, but also demanded, as the war itself did, that emancipation lead to equality, to equal opportunity, and to full citizenship for African Americans. That African American memory of the Civil War persists from then until today, and it's important to remember that. The second version of Civil War memory that emerges is in the white North. The white North continues to believe it had been right in the war, that the South was wrong, that secession was rebellion. And they celebrated the fact that they had preserved the Union. They celebrated the fact that they had ended slavery, and they saw that as eliminating the nation's one sin and therefore establishing even more firmly the righteousness of the nation. But they didn't talk about emancipation as much as they talked about preserving the Union. And they never saw emancipation necessarily as linked to equality the way the African American memory did. The third memory is the memory of the white South, what you still hear described as the lost cause. The white South accepts reunion and they accept emancipation, but they are still committed to the preservation of white supremacy. The South believed it had done nothing wrong. White Southerners believed secession was legal and that there was nothing wrong with slavery. Indeed, by the early 20th century, they will prevent a sort of celebration of the wonders of slavery. But they changed the way they talk about secession. And they stress and adamantly maintain that the war was about states' rights, not about slavery. They too celebrate their soldiers. They argue that Confederate soldiers fought honorably and well and bravely. And they particularly celebrated their leaders, particularly Robert E. Lee, who they saw as the embodiment of Confederate nationalism and as a splendid example of their heroism and military skill. By the early 20th century, and certainly by the 1920s, the memory of the Civil War begins to change. By the 1890s, the South has reestablished white supremacy with a rigid repressive racial order based on disfranchisement and white racial violence. And that succeeds in minimizing the impact of the African American memory of the war. At the same time, the white South and the white North are most concerned about establishing American nationalism. And to achieve that goal, there's a tacit agreement, even though neither side has changed its view of what the war was about or what the war accomplished. There's a tacit agreement not to talk about the issues of the war, but instead to celebrate the romance of the battlefield and the heroism and the honor of the soldiers on both sides. And that, in the 20th century, becomes the dominant white memory of the Civil War. It persists into the celebration of the Civil War centennial. But the Civil War centennial occurs at the same time as the Civil Rights Movement. And that begins a process of challenging the uses and definitions of Civil War memory. Many Southern segregationists used the lost cause to fight against the Civil Rights Movement. You see that in the naming of streets and schools. Baton Rouge itself has recently had a debate over the name of the high school formerly known as Lee High, and it dates from this period. But even more than names and heroes, the Confederate flag becomes a central symbol of opposition to the Civil Rights Movement. It's in this era that the Confederate flag goes atop the capitals of South Carolina, Alabama, and Florida, and goes on the state flag in Georgia. And the Confederate flag is used by segregationist mobs and by the Ku Klux Klan as a symbol of resistance to racial change. That use has a tremendous impact on making the Confederate flag a symbol of racism, but also of defiance and grievance. The second development that emerges, however, is the success of the Civil Rights Movement leads to African American gains in political and cultural authority, which will reshape the fights over Civil War memory. They persist even in the 60s, the 70s, and into the 80s. But it's really in the 1990s that I want to focus on a tremendous debate, a tremendous battle over Civil War memory. In 1988, Princeton historian James McPherson publishes a book called The Battle Cry of Freedom, which, as the title suggests, makes slavery central to the history of the Civil War. Unlike most historians' books, especially mine, McPherson's book was actually read by lots of people. It made the bestseller list. It won a Pulitzer Prize. 2 years later, Ken Burns introduces his masterful summary, The Civil War, which becomes one of the most popular series ever broadcast on public television. Burns's presentation of the Civil War did not escape the romanticism of the battlefield, but it did stress the role of slavery in the Civil War. A few years later, Congress refuses to grant a pension to the United Daughters of the Confederacy because its symbol included a Confederate flag. In 1994, the governor of Georgia calls for a change to take the battle flag off of the state flag of Georgia. He is worried about the impact of the Confederate flag on international businesses and people who would be coming to Atlanta for the Olympics in 1996. Those early moves set off a debate throughout the remainder of the 1990s and into the early 20th century over the flying of the Confederate flag in Florida and Alabama and South Carolina, and the flag's incorporation into the state flags of Georgia and Mississippi. In everywhere but Mississippi, a compromise is reached to take down the flag, to change the state flag, to minimize the celebration of the Confederacy. That fight of the 1990s shows signs of three significant changes in the battle over Confederate memory. First of all, African Americans play a crucial role in the fight. Second, the cultural and commercial elite has shifted its role in supporting the use of Confederate symbols. In both the Lost Cause and even earlier in the North, the cultural and economic elite helped define the meaning of the Civil War. Increasingly in the 1990s, the cultural elite begins to emphasize the role of slavery in the Civil War. You see it in popular culture, you see it in museum exhibits, you see it in the way the National Park Service treats the war. And in those fights over the Confederate flag, even the economic elite, again, worried in part about what sort of symbol the Confederate flag said about, what a symbol like the Confederate flag said about Southern society, and whether or not that would threaten economic development, They have changed things. The third change that's interesting is, as never before, the fight over Confederate symbolism becomes politicized. In his campaign for the Republican nomination for president, Patrick Buchanan makes the Confederate flag and flying a Confederate flag a major part of his campaign. And the fight over the Confederate flag in South Carolina is embraced by both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, one for, one against, and write it into their platforms. So, as never before in the 90s, the fight becomes politicized. That leads us to the final stage, which I believe begins in 2011 and continues to today. You remember between 2011 and 2015, you have the Civil War sesquicentennial. I suspect very few of you can tell me what you did to celebrate the sesquicentennial. My students are unaware that it happened. It's very interesting that you have such a low-key celebration of the sesquicentennial. I sometimes joke it's because people are embarrassed to pronounce sesquicentennial in public, as I am even as I speak. But it has more to do with the fact that people don't care as much about the Civil War as many people think they do. But even more importantly, I think Americans realize there remained this fundamental cultural divide over what the Civil War meant. And yet, right at the end of the sesquicentennial, all of a sudden, the Civil War becomes a major point of division again. And it begins that June when Dylan Roof walked into a African Methodist Episcopal church in Charleston, South Carolina, and murdered 9 worshipers. When the public became aware that he had pictures with the Confederate flag, it sets off a renewed debate over Confederate symbolism and the Confederate flag. In South Carolina, it was a debate over whether or not to continue flying the flag on the Capitol grounds. In New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu calls for and 4 Confederate monuments come down. You may have heard something about that. 2 years later, you have a major confrontation and another murder in Charlottesville, Virginia, over taking down the Lee Monument. And then you have, where I started this talk, the post-George Floyd developments. Our divisions in this latest fight over Civil War memory are clear. If you look at polling data about whether or not the flag and the monuments are symbols of racism or Southern pride, you find a nation fundamentally divided. If you poll Americans and ask them what caused the Civil War, if you ask, did slavery cause the Civil War? A bare majority will say yes. If you give them the choice of picking states' rights, more will actually pick states' rights. The divisions are still very real. But the divisions in this fight are quite interesting. You still have the leadership in the fight against Confederate symbolism coming from the African American community. You still probably have greater support among white Southerners for Confederate symbolism than among other groups. There is still some loyalty to their ancestors. But the interesting thing is today, only about 1 Southerner in 3 knows whether or not they had a Confederate ancestor. And most of them don't know much about them. But if you look at the divisions of this latest battle over Civil War memory, they are very interesting. If you look at support for and against public displays of the Confederate flag, you find 3 major divisions. One is wealth and education. With the less wealthy and the less well-educated, more likely to support flying the Confederate flag. The second big division is partisanship. Republicans are far more likely to support the flying of the flag than Democrats. And the third is an urban-rural split. Rural Americans are more likely to fly and support the flying of the Confederate flag than urban Americans. I would add one more division with a fascinating polling question. In 2000, A pollster asked the question whether the United States government in Washington pays too much or not enough attention to the needs of blacks. The people who answered that question by saying the government didn't pay enough attention to the needs of blacks, among that group, only 22% supported the public display of the Confederate flag. Among those people who said, no, the government is paying too much attention to the needs of blacks, 74% of them said we should continue to fly the Confederate flag. So why do we fight over Civil War memory? Because Americans have failed to develop a common shared memory of the Civil War. We remain divided over its cause and its meanings. And for many Americans, the continued celebration of the Confederacy and its symbols is not only a denial of history, but a refusal to face the present. A refusal to face that 180 years after emancipation, Americans have still not established a society of full equality and equal opportunity for African Americans. The dispute is as much over the present as over the past. And the sides in the continuing debate over Civil War memory reflect less the divisions of the 1860s than the deep cultural and political divide in our country today. Achieving a just peace in our battle over Civil War memory will be a small step toward healing that dangerous division. Thank you. I think we're going to have time for questions.
Great. That was very enlightening, very interesting. Thanks, Professor. We do have a question from Barbara Otten. She says, it's my understanding that President Ulysses S. Grant had a much greater plan to integrate society that ended up being pushed aside. What do you know of that?
Well, historians can't agree on anything, and we certainly debate over Grant's role. I think Grant was initially and continued to be more committed to the creation of a just order in the South than he was able to achieve in Reconstruction. So that I would agree with those who give Grant a great deal of credit, but in the end, he failed to make it all work.
And why do you think he did? What was it? What was the problem? Why was he unable to?
Well, you've got several problems. The biggest problem is, again, the white South is unalterably committed to the maintenance of white supremacy. So the question becomes, how does the federal government and therefore the president change that? And the options aren't great. We don't do anything to change the economic order in the South. The federal government will not redistribute property. The major solution then becomes military power, which Grant uses at times and at other times doesn't. And so the question really becomes, is the outcome inevitable? Maybe not, but it would have been very difficult for Grant to make it work.
And I know you're more of a historian, but as you look on the horizon today, from a historian's point of view, so that we don't try and repeat things, what should we be doing differently going forward?
Well, I think we really need to think deeply about, as I said at the end, this divide within American society that the debate over Civil War memory is really just an example of, not a cause of, I think. And I mean, we need to address the systemic inequalities in American society. We need to develop a commitment to the common good within the Republic, and we need to achieve some sense of shared purpose about that common good.
Susan Nelson said, I love the concept of a public memory of history versus actual history. How has education, particularly K through 12, impacted this public memory?
That's a great question. And I would say that for a very long time, K through 12 education, especially in the textbooks, very heavily influenced by a need to meet a Southern market, would have embraced the sort of overview of the war, the romanticization, the stress on the heroism, and to some extent de-emphasizes the issues, particularly slavery in the coming of the war. I think over the last 20 or 30 years, there has been a systematic attempt by educational leaders to focus on the role of slavery in American society and the role of slavery in the coming of the Civil War. That in itself has become part of this battle. And you've had pushback by state legislatures against how the war is treated and other places. And I must confess, I still have a frightful number of students in my classes who say they were taught a very romantic view of the Civil War that stressed the heroism, stressed states' rights, and diminished the role of slavery.
I can say that was my experience in high school in the 70s, and even early LSU in the early 80s.
Yes. Ooh. That I don't like to hear. I was here in the early 80s.
Yeah, but I didn't have one of your classes then.
Okay, good. I'm also there.
No, sir, you weren't. Well, I don't see any more questions, Professor. This was really great. Thank you for shedding some information and helping us to kind of learn that there is actual a difference between the public memory and what actual history really was. This was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been fun. If anybody has further questions, they can always email me.
Great. Well, we'll certainly let your contact information be known.
Or fields that I need to be educated.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor. Have a great holiday.